Welcome to the Designated Drinker Show's Icon series. I am Louise Solis, and typically, I am your host. But in this limited series, I'm handing over the reins to historian John Taylor Chapman as he takes us on a journey through history. So sit back, grab a cocktail, and enjoy.
Yes, I'm your host, John Taylor Chapman, and indeed, I'm going to take you on a trip through time to explore African and African American cultural heritage, history, and legacy. This is no ordinary history class, not even close. Each week, I will be joined by some highly respected historians and amazing storytellers, so I promise you this, our conversations will be lively and empowering. So let's get started, shall we? Today, we're going to chat about one of the least talked about time periods, but possibly the most impactful to our communities today. Those few years after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction. Like I stated, Reconstruction is one of the most impactful time periods for African Americans because during this time, they are seeking new freedoms, but still facing the challenges of the past. And here to tell the rest of this important story from this time period is local community historian and Alexandria Living Legend, McArthur Myers. Welcome to the show, Mac.
Thank you, Councilman Chapman. I don't know if I should call you John or brother Chapman, but first, I'd like to welcome you to Universal Lodge, the host house as we are today, which is the oldest Prince Hall Lodge in the state of Virginia, 177 years old as of February the 5th, this past Saturday. So here we are. But you brought up a great topic. In order to get to Reconstruction, I'd like to just digress to the beginning of Alexandria from 1749 to 1846 when they retroceded, because some things was in place that impacted Reconstruction's desires. For instance, when 1791 to 1846, when Alexandria was part of what they call Alexandria, D.C., black folks was able to go to school, was able to interact and travel freely among the city. However, after 1846, they came up with the black codes. And the black codes, for example, give you an example, 3 black folks was seen together would constitute a riot. And a lot of this came as a result of the 1838 Nat Turner rebellion down in southeastern Virginia. So saying that to say this, 1846 to the actual the Civil War was a hard time in Alexandria because of the changing demographics. Slavery, 1820, Alexandria became the largest slave port in America with Franklin Armfield. Thousands of ancestors was sent down to Florida, Georgia, Texas because of the changing of the crop up here. Cotton became king, sugar became king along the Gulf Coast. So 1846 to 1861 was a pivotal time because America was talking about ending slavery, pro-slavery, anti-slavery. And in Alexandria, we were, say, fortunate because there was a lot of Quakers in this town. And the Quakers was the Society of Friends, as some would know, but most don't know, they was against slavery. And so they had a great interaction with the enslaved and the free blacks. They even helped form a community called Hayti, which is down there on 400 block of South Royal Street. With Alexandria, 1861 was the first city taken over after Fort Sumter. Colonel Ellsworth, a Union soldier, came to Alexandria and at the Marshall House took down the flag, and George Jackson shot him, and who subsequently he got shot and killed. Was the first town taken over. And Alexandria was pivotal because they had railroad and the water. Railroad being a major industry that would go into the heartland of Virginia, bring in the produce, products and produce and coal, if you will, minerals into Alexandria, down the Potomac. Because Alexandria at one time was the 7th largest seaport town in America along the East Coast, Boston. Yeah, you had Boston, New York, Baltimore, Georgetown, Alexandria, then you had Norfolk, then you had Charleston, and so it went south, and Savannah. So it was a major port internationally. Being with the slave industry with Franklin Armfield from 1820 to 1861 when the Union soldiers took over. So in order to understand Reconstruction time, you got to understand what Alexandria role played in the forming of the state convention. I could go back to Bacon Rebellion, but I won't do that during the Revolutionary time. But the same thing that was concerned about Western Virginia, because there wasn't no West Virginia state. So Western Virginia and Wheeling had a conference under a gentleman by the name of Francis Pierpont. Francis Pierpont, in that convention, by what they called themselves the Radicals, who was pro-unionist, because Virginia has ceded. And so Francis Pierpont had made a letter of allegiance to the Union, and President Lincoln had allowed them to come to Alexandria. One, because of protection. Two, because they were close to the Congress, they were close to the District of Columbia, where they can interact. So what President Lincoln did was gave Virginia a mandate for Union-held territory to have a convention. So April the 16th, 1862, Lincoln wrote a proclamation freeing the African-American enslaved in the District of Columbia proper. Mm-hmm. But 1862, then 1860, he said after that, all the states that ceded, you can join the Union, rejoin the Union by January the 1st, 1863. So 1863, he issued another proclamation saying all Union-held territory, black folks enslaved, all free. So with that being said, Pierpont moved to Alexandria, which at that time became Union-held capital of Virginia, which was at the Gadsby Tavern at the corner of Fairfax and Royal Street. So within that, black folks was coming to this town for, they would call them contraband, which I don't use the word. I say human beings and refugees came to this town for safe haven in the numbers. And so within that, Pierpont had ordered a constitutional convention here, which was to rewrite what they call the restored government, to rewrite the Constitution of Virginia. Okay, so that being said, that's not the Constitution of 1870, which we'll get to, but 1863, they had a discussion and that rewrote the Constitution, but at the same time, April the 7th, 1864 was, in Alexandria, was the freedom of all African Americans in Alexandria. Mm-hmm. So you had an Emancipation Proclamation in 62, you had one in 63, then you had one in 64 that impacted Alexandria. Mm-hmm. So that being said, these gentlemen that was involved, people like McNaughton, who's out of Yorktown. We had progressive-minded men here in Alexandria. You had George Seaton, mm-hmm. you had John Seaton, mm-hmm. you had Fields Cook, and all of them played pivotal roles. You had George Washington Parker, you had Thomas Penn, you had a myriad of different gentlemen. For instance, once that Constitution of the Emancipation of 1864, they was mandated to continue to write the Constitution of Virginia. So what happened was, in 1870, they finally got to the point where they were ready to go and ratify this. So 1861 to 1870, you had organizations that was pivotal, fraternal organization, churches, and you also had the idea of a developing institution. What's the institution? Banking, schools, hospitals, benevolent societies. All this came with the discussion of what people need. It wasn't about separation. It was about nation building. Nation building is what they was trying to do, black and white. For instance, 1870, they had a convention here at 411 South Columbus Street, which was on the site of Bethlehem Church. But before, then it was Oddfellow Hall. You had Bethlehem Church, and then George Seaton built around that, enlarged the building, which became Oddfellow Hall. And then there you had Benevolent Society, so forth and so on.
So for our listeners, a benevolent society was the early formation of anti-slavery groups or organizations, many times made up of Quakers or those with a religious background.
So 1870, they had election. George Washington Parker, who was the founder of Third Baptist Church here in Alexandria, was elected city councilman. John A. Seaton, because of the ward system, he was in charge of the Jefferson Ward. He was elected. That's his brother George Seaton was elected House of Delegate. By the way, George Seaton was worth $100,000. He was the richest black man in the state of Virginia at the time of his death, which was 1881. But saying that to say this, then Thomas Penn, he was elected as an alternate delegate to the state convention in Richmond. So I'm saying all this to say, all right, that's under restored government. Then you have...
So Mac, if you give me a second, I want to explain to our listeners what the restored government was. If everybody remembers, the original government of Virginia had succeeded during the course of the Civil War, and now this restored government of Virginia is going to be the state government, which is now put together in opposition to the secessionist government to really bring back Virginia into the Union.
But let's go back to 1865. Lee in April surrendered in Appomattox. I think April the 9th. Then Lincoln gets shot. The returning soldiers coming back to Alexandria, and the way I'm going with this is that 1865 was the first time that blacks were free. And celebrating that freedom was some called Independence Day for blacks.
So Mac, was there any kind of local blowback with this new freedom for blacks?
There was a tragedy that happened at Market Square, December 25th. They call it the Christmas Day Massacre, the Christmas Day Riot. Because what happened was a lot of people were saying, wait a minute, you are my property. People were trying to get their property back. Who are you? Da, 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 da. So that whole institution of you are not a human being, you steal my property, and this predates the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. See, that didn't come in until later on. As a result, to try to empower everybody that were born on this soil is American. So Market Square, December 25th, 14 blacks got killed. Then you have, they said 2 whites got injured, but that was a battle. The thing that happened is, the whites call it a riot. Black folks call it a massacre. And you'll see that dichotomy throughout history, the difference in how people look at things. So one of the major institutions that were formed was education. Education formally didn't come into Alexandria until 1870, and that was, had a convention at Alfred Street Baptist Church where they acknowledged that, but all that was part of the Reconstruction plan. Freeman Bureau, which was at 411 South Columbus Street, was managed in Northern Virginia by Phil's Cook, also a pastor out of Richmond, but a pastor for Third Baptist and later the founder of Ebenezer Church. But the schools, remember I said prior to 1846, there was public school. Then when the retrocession, black folks, there was no schools, and there was school, but sometimes they taught the kids in the alleys. You know, the alleys was the internet of his day.
Sorry, again, Mac, let me explain for our listeners what retrocession is. Retrocession happens when the Commonwealth of Virginia takes back Alexandria and parts of Arlington back from Washington, D.C. Originally, when Washington, D.C. is formed in 1801, parts of Arlington and Alexandria make up the southwestern portion of this new area. But the Commonwealth takes that back in 1847.
Anyway, how people communicate was by passing through the alleys, just chatting or catching up on family members and so forth.
Alexandria has a lot of alleys, so
yeah, they do. They do. Yeah, they do. Because people was getting, before we get into the Jim Crow era, but people were getting beaten just for having a book. Because see, under that Black Code manumission, Alexandria had a law that said if you freed, you had to be out within sometime the next day, but definitely within a year. You had to leave the state. And if you was educated, you couldn't come into the city. They flooded the city during the Civil War. People like Harriet Jacobs, she came out in Cambridge, Mass, but she and her daughter Lucy. I have a picture of the house, of the school. They call it the Meeting House on the corner of Pitt and Orinoco Street, which is the founding spot for Beulah Church and Third Baptist. So schools, education, school. So you have 1870 was the formalization and legalizing education in the city. So therefore, you're getting your nation building, churches, schools, banking, and hospitals. Because during all the time you had major hospitals because Alexandria was the convalescent center for the Union soldiers. Of course, that's been depicted on Mercy Street and all that. So I'm saying that to say, from Reconstruction. So the compromise election of 1876, in all intent and purpose, put an end to Reconstruction. That's right after, that's the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. But you had 1875, the first Civil Rights Act. That was in the Grant administration. And President Grant, which was great. That's where the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. Of course, the 13th came in under the Johnson administration after Lincoln was shot, Andrew Johnson. He vetoed it, but Congress, with the radical Republican, overrode his veto. So you had 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment setting the tone, in essence, what the continuation of the dream of America, which we still fighting in 2022.
So let me, for our listeners, they've heard a lot of history in a real short time frame. Let me try to drill down on some of the bigger stories, especially within Reconstruction, because I think a lot of people, a lot of visitors to the city, a lot of residents in our area aren't necessarily aware of all of the action, shall you say, that happens in somewhere like Alexandria during Reconstruction. I mean, you've already talked a couple of times about conventions happening. You know, what's happening at those conventions that makes the conventions that happen important for Reconstruction and kind of for the story of Reconstruction?
Okay. Let's understand what the word Reconstruction means. The word Reconstruction means we need to reconstruct America after the Civil War and devastation.
That's right.
And after, I mean, the South was bankrupt. The economy was gone. You had laws coming into vagrancy laws, basically, which would arrest someone because they didn't have a home or they were on the street. And out of that vagrancy law, they would be sent to prison or to jail, and then they would rent it out. So my point is, Reconstruction was, okay, America, let's take a look at what we need to do to rebuild. And so reconstruct. But within that dichotomy and paradigm was and is, you got the human piece in there. And you got the human piece of Black folks as free. And what are we going to do with the Black folks? At the same time, what do the Black folks want for themselves? And basically what they want for themselves is, and that was the driver for the conventions. And in there, they want one man, one vote. So the convention, inside the convention, they wanted schools, they wanted quality of life issues, school, banking, the right to vote, the right to participate, the right of representation. Now, Alexandria was unique. And how is it so unique? Because of the proximity to the nation capital. So what the people basically wanted was quality of life issues and inclusion. Inclusion wasn't happening, then they develop on their own. They develop. So from 76, let's say, to 1892, that's when the Jim Crow started coming in. Because primarily after the Hayes-Tilden compromise, where Rutherford B. Hayes became the president, Samuel Tilden, he asked that all the Union soldiers be moved out of the South. His history goes back, he was, I don't know if he was pro-slavery or anti-slavery, but I think he was kind of pro-slavery. But anyway, that compromise, that they moved the soldiers out. Alexandria had, back then, had the U.S. colored troops here as well. They moved them soldiers out to Washington, back to D.C. And then came the South and Jim Crow.
So, with that, what I want to try to do is compartmentalize everything that's happened prior to that point. What would you say is, for anybody that's interested in our local history, what is in your estimation, the most impactful event in those years between the end of the Civil War and the start of Jim Crow?
That's a great question, because that was a time where people, being human beings, were really understanding freedom to move, but they had to adjust as the laws and quote-unquote rules of control. Because you remember, the whites lost property, quote-unquote. They lost money. So they lost the economy and the workers, the worker bees and the workers. So I'm saying that to say that, for me, every day was an important day. Because you didn't know, people were just killing people, for whatever emotional reason, anger, or you don't have no right. I gave an example of the Christmas Day riot.
Right.
Because how it goes in terms of the dichotomy in diaspora, African American, it used to be called Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, and now they call because you had first free, which was the enslaved, then their offspring. I'm only third generation from slavery. I'm third. You may be fourth, John. I'm a little older than you. Yeah, right. Keep the change. But no, seriously. So first free was the former enslaved. And then people was dying too, from sickness, from bad health. I mean, look at us. I don't use the word contraband, but we had a Freeman Cemetery here, and that over almost 2,000 people known that were died and buried in that cemetery on South Washington Street. And so everyday living, quality of life, but in my mind, the one that really set the tone was the Christmas Day riot of 1865. In my mind.
Okay.
Because God, you had to fight to live. I'm just talking about just to live, because of God-given right to live.
Okay. So, Mac, this has been amazing to hear.
I just got started.
Thank you. You did just get started, and so listeners, please understand that this is not the end of our discussion with Mac. This is only the kind of end of the first part of our two-part episode. Because we know Mac has a lot to share. We are going to be coming back to you next week as we talk more history and honor more spirits with McArthur Myers.
Thank you, John.
The cocktails inspired by today's guest and living legend, McArthur Myers, were crafted by master barkeep John Schott, co-owner of King's Ransom, which is located right here in Old Town Alexandria. So to check out his twist on a few classics like his Truffled Dirty Martini and Pear Rosemary Bee's Knees, or to find out how you can join one of John Chapman's manumission Black History guided walking tours, head over to designateddrinker.show. That's designateddrinker.show. The Designated Drinker Show is produced by Missing Link, a podcast media company that is dedicated to connecting people to intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Also in the Missing Link lineup of podcasts is Roger That, a podcast dedicated to guiding you through the haze of dementia, led by skilled caregivers Bobby and Mike Carducci. Now, if you're looking for a whole new way to enjoy the theater, check out Between Acts, an immersive audio theater podcast experience. Each episode takes you on a spellbinding journey through the works of newfound playwrights, from dramas to comedies and everything in between. Find Missing Link's League of Podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Please don't forget to subscribe, download, and review the shows. Your review helps our shows reach new audiences. To find out more about Missing Link, visit missinglink.company. That's missinglink.company.